It started with a low rumble, then the ground roared like a beast awakened. In just 60 seconds, the Earth released more energy than several nuclear bombs combined. And now the world is asking, what really happened beneath Kamchatka? At 3:47 a.m. local time, the ground beneath the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia tore itself apart. The seismographs around the world lit up. A massive 8.8 magnitude earthquake had struck just off the eastern coast. Though this region is no stranger to tectonic activity, this event was among the strongest ever recorded in human history. For comparison, the 2010 Chile earthquake, also an 8.8, killed more than 500 people and triggered a Pacific-wide tsunami. The Kamchatka quake occurred in a similarly volatile tectonic zone, one where the Pacific plate dives beneath the Okhotsk plate, forming a subduction zone known for megaquakes. The sudden release of pressure along the fault line triggered seismic waves that traveled across the globe. Within minutes, tsunami warnings were issued for countries across the Pacific Ocean: Japan, the Philippines, Hawaii, even the west coast of the United States. Sirens blared in towns perched along shorelines. Emergency broadcasts interrupted programming. Social media exploded with clips of shaking buildings, terrified residents, and waves slowly receding from beaches. But what causes an earthquake of such magnitude? Earthquakes happen when stress builds up along faults, fractures between blocks of the Earth's crust, and is suddenly released. In subduction zones like the one near Kamchatka, one tectonic plate is forced underneath another. Over decades or even centuries, the plates lock and stress accumulates. Then, in a matter of seconds, the plates slip, unleashing colossal energy. In the case of this quake, the rupture may have extended for hundreds of kilometers deep beneath the ocean floor. The United States Geological Survey, USGS, quickly classified the quake as a megathrust earthquake, the most powerful type on Earth. These events occur at convergent plate boundaries and are responsible for the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. Think Indonesia in 2004 or Japan in 2011. Kamchatka is one of the few places on Earth where all the conditions for a megathrust quake align perfectly: dense, active subduction, high seismic stress, and minimal historic release. The depth of the earthquake, estimated at around 29 kilometers, meant the shaking was widespread. People as far as Anchorage, Alaska, and northern Japan reported feeling tremors. In Kamchatka itself, the shaking lasted over a minute, cracking roads, toppling power lines, and triggering localized landslides. Thankfully, the region's sparse population meant there were relatively few casualties. Still, dozens were injured, and infrastructure damage was significant. Satellite data showed the Earth's crust in the region shifted by several meters. This kind of movement doesn't just crack the surface, it alters the landscape. Coastal areas were uplifted, riverbeds shifted, and ground levels changed permanently. One village reported that its shoreline had moved 100 feet inland. Some experts even worry that the tectonic stress redistributed by this quake could trigger further quakes or eruptions along the Pacific Ring of Fire. One of the most immediate concerns was the tsunami threat. In 2004, a 9.1 magnitude quake off Sumatra triggered waves up to 100 feet tall. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued alerts across the basin. In Hawaii, roads near the coast were closed and shelters opened. In Japan, bullet trains were halted and coastal communities were evacuated. Along the US West Coast, emergency crews stood by and residents were warned to stay away from beaches. Fortunately, this time, the tsunami waves that did reach populated areas were far less severe than feared. In Severokurilsk, a Russian town near the epicenter, a wave about 1.5 meters high flooded some roads but caused no major injuries. By the time the waves reached Hawaii and Japan, they had diminished to under a meter. Experts later explained that while the quake was massive, its fault rupture angle and undersea topography limited the energy transferred into the ocean. But that doesn't mean the danger was any less real. Seismologists are now studying aftershocks, which have continued to rattle the region. More than 60 have been recorded in the 24 hours following the main quake, some reaching magnitude 6.5 or higher. These aftershocks are expected and may continue for weeks. The region's volcanoes, particularly Klyuchevskoy, which erupted hours later, are also being closely monitored. The connection between massive quakes and volcanic activity is a topic of active research, and this event may offer new insights. Why is this important to the United States? First, the Pacific Rim is a connected system. What happens in Kamchatka affects the US, both physically and geopolitically. Tsunami warnings impact millions of Americans in coastal states. The Pacific Ring of Fire includes California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, states with similar tectonic vulnerabilities. Studying this quake helps scientists better understand the potential for a similar event closer to home. Second, events like these serve as real-time tests of emergency preparedness. The tsunami warnings, though ultimately cautious, proved the alert systems work. But they also revealed vulnerabilities, communication lags, traffic gridlock during evacuations, and gaps in public awareness. In California, for instance, some coastal residents said they didn't even receive alerts or weren't sure what to do when they did. For emergency planners, this quake was a wake-up call. Finally, there's the broader question of climate change and geological feedback. While climate change doesn't cause earthquakes directly, the warming of glaciers and shifting ocean weights can influence fault activity. As the Arctic melts and sea levels rise, pressure on tectonic plates changes. This is especially relevant in regions like Alaska, Greenland, and yes, Kamchatka. The intersection of climate and geology is still emerging science, but events like this underline its urgency. As recovery begins in Kamchatka, the scientific world is just beginning to analyze what happened. Early data suggests that the earthquake was one of the most powerful ever recorded in the Northern Pacific. More detailed seismic mapping is underway. Ocean floor sensors and GPS satellites are feeding back terabytes of data. Meanwhile, volcanologists are investigating whether the quake triggered magma movement under the volcanoes nearby. For now, the Earth has quieted, but its message was loud and clear. In just a minute, a hidden fault line under the ocean reminded the world of the planet's immense power. And while Kamchatka may seem remote, its seismic pulse resonates across oceans, warning us once again that the ground beneath our feet is never truly still. The eruption didn't wait. Just hours after the 8.8 magnitude earthquake sent seismic energy rolling through the Kamchatka Peninsula, one of Earth's most formidable volcanoes responded. Klyuchevskoy, a stratovolcano that towers more than 15,500 feet into the sky, came alive in a blaze of fire and ash. What caused this sudden and violent reaction? Was it purely coincidental, or was it triggered directly by the quake? To understand what happened, we must look deeper into the relationship between the Earth's crust, tectonic pressure, and volcanic systems under stress. When a major earthquake ruptures the crust, it doesn't just shake the surface. It redistributes pressure throughout vast regions of rock layers. This pressure change can reach magma chambers lying miles beneath volcanoes. If a volcanic system is already primed, meaning that magma is rising, gas is accumulating, and pressure is building, an earthquake can act like the final push that removes the cork from a bottle. In geophysical terms, this is known as seismic triggering, and it's a well-documented phenomenon in volcanic science. However, not all earthquakes cause eruptions, and not all eruptions need an earthquake. It's the rare convergence of both that brings explosive results. Satellite data, released in the hours after the Kamchatka quake, revealed a sudden thermal spike beneath Klyuchevskoy's summit. Instruments recorded low-frequency tremors, typically associated with magma movement. The temperature of the surface increased rapidly, and infrared imaging picked up a broadening heat plume extending down the eastern flank. Then came harmonic tremor, a continuous ground vibration that often indicates magma is forcing its way upward. For volcanologists, it was a textbook case of a volcano being pushed over the edge by external stress. Klyuchevskoy is one of the most active volcanoes in the world. Located along the Pacific Ring of Fire, it's built by centuries of eruptions, layer upon layer of cooled lava and pyroclastic material. Eruptions occur frequently, sometimes annually, but not always with this kind of power. In this case, the quake likely fractured the rock barrier that had been holding magma in place. With the structure compromised, molten rock surged upward, followed by volcanic gases and ash. The speed of the eruption surprised scientists. It began less than 3 hours after the earthquake, a short interval, geologically speaking. Some argued that such a rapid sequence confirmed a direct trigger. Others noted that Klyuchevskoy had been showing elevated signs of unrest for weeks prior, including ground inflation and increased gas emissions. The truth likely lies somewhere between. The volcano was already unstable, and the quake provided the final stressor that breached its internal defenses. Geophysical models reconstructed in the days after the event show a dramatic shift in crustal stress across the region. The earthquake ruptured hundreds of kilometers of subduction zone, changing the balance of forces along the nearby volcanic arc. Klyuchevskoy, sitting atop a network of deep magma conduits, absorbed that stress in full. These simulations match similar events observed in Chile 2010 and the Philippines 1991, where major quakes preceded large eruptions. But unlike those cases, this reaction was nearly immediate. The eruption itself was classified as VEI-3, moderate in explosive scale but significant due to its context. Ash plumes rose over 10 kilometers into the sky. Lava fountains erupted from multiple vents, while pyroclastic flows surged down canyons near the base. Volcanic lightning, caused by the friction of ash particles in the atmosphere, crackled above the summit in blue and purple bolts. Local villages were covered in ash, though no deaths were reported thanks to rapid evacuation orders. From an aviation perspective, the eruption created a serious hazard. Ash clouds at cruising altitudes can disable jet engines, obscure visibility, and erode aircraft surfaces. Within 6 hours of the eruption, aviation alerts were raised to red, and dozens of flights across the Pacific were rerouted. Airlines flying between North America and Asia adjusted their flight paths to avoid the region. This added time, fuel costs, and disruption to global supply chains, an economic ripple effect from a natural trigger. As the world watched, volcanologists took the opportunity to test new instruments. Drones equipped with gas sensors flew into the ash cloud to measure sulfur dioxide levels, helping to estimate the eruption's impact on the upper atmosphere. These gases, particularly SO2, are crucial for climate modeling, as they can reflect solar radiation and cause temporary cooling effects. While the Kamchatka plume wasn't large enough to alter global climate significantly, it provided valuable data for refining predictive models. The question remains, could more volcanoes follow? The Kamchatka Peninsula has over 160 volcanoes, 29 of them active. After a seismic event of this scale, the stress redistribution could activate other systems. Scientists are monitoring volcanoes such as Shiveluch, Bezimiany, and Karimsky for signs of increased activity. Each has erupted in the past decade, and each is sensitive to crustal disturbances. But the implications extend beyond Russia. Around the Ring of Fire, from Japan to Alaska, from Indonesia to Chile, experts are re-evaluating the risk of seismic volcanic interactions. Could a quake in one region influence a volcano in another? Could global warming, which alters glacial weight on Earth's surface, contribute to tectonic stress? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the focus of urgent research. What makes the Kamchatka event particularly instructive is the speed at which it unfolded. Unlike slow-building eruptions that give weeks or months of warning, this was a sudden chain reaction, quake to eruption in less than a morning. It challenges assumptions about the timeline between tectonic rupture and magmatic response, and it underscores the need for continuous monitoring, not just of volcanoes, but of the entire systems they sit upon. Klyuchevskoy has now entered a cooling phase. Lava flows have slowed, and gas emissions are decreasing. But aftershocks continue, and the ground remains unstable. There is no guarantee that the eruption is over. Secondary vents may still activate. A dome collapse could trigger lahars, mudflows caused by the mixing of ash and melted snow, which can destroy anything in their path. The landscape has changed, and so has the risk profile. In the coming weeks, scientists will study rock samples from the new lava, looking for chemical signatures that reveal how deep the magma originated and how fast it ascended. GPS stations will track whether the volcano is still inflating or deflating, and remote sensors will monitor thermal anomalies that could warn of renewed activity. For now, Klyuchevskoy stands silent but steaming, a reminder that beneath the frozen skin of Kamchatka lies a fiery core that responds to the slightest pressure shift. The quake pulled the trigger, but the gun had been loaded long before. Hidden behind clouds, tundra, and isolation, Kamchatka may be one of the most geologically dangerous places on the planet, and yet one of the least understood by the world. Most people have never heard the name. Fewer could point to it on a map. And yet, this stretch of land in Russia's Far East may hold the key to understanding future disasters, not just in Eurasia, but across the Pacific Rim. Kamchatka is not just remote, it is alive, boiling, shifting, and constantly reshaping itself in silence. The Kamchatka Peninsula is home to over 160 volcanoes, of which 29 are classified as active. This is the highest concentration of active volcanoes in the Northern Hemisphere. It sits directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, the vast volatile belt that wraps around the Pacific Ocean, where tectonic plates grind, collide, and subduct. From Alaska to New Zealand, from Japan to Chile, this ring contains 75% of the world's active volcanoes, and Kamchatka sits squarely on one of its most volatile edges. What makes Kamchatka unique isn't just how many volcanoes it has, it's the diversity and power of those volcanoes. Klyuchevskoy, which erupted following the July 30th earthquake, is just one among many giants. Mount Shiveluch, Bezimiany, Tolbachik and Karimsky have all erupted within the last 20 years, some multiple times. These aren't minor surface blasts. These are full-scale events, capable of launching ash 10 to 15 kilometers into the stratosphere, disrupting aviation and altering the atmosphere. Most of these volcanoes are stratovolcanoes, meaning they're tall, conical, and prone to explosive eruptions. Built from layers of hardened lava, ash, and volcanic rock, they're structurally steep and geologically unstable. When they erupt, they don't just ooze lava, they blast it, along with pyroclastic flows, superheated gases, and volcanic bombs that can travel miles from the crater. Satellite data over the last decade shows a steady increase in geothermal anomalies across Kamchatka. While some of this is due to improved observation capabilities, it also reflects a trend. Many of Kamchatka's volcanoes are entering renewed periods of activity. The July 2025 eruption of Klyuchevskoy may not be an isolated event. It may be the first in a new cycle. Geographically, Kamchatka is a paradox. On the one hand, it's massive, over 1,200 kilometers long, bordered by the Pacific Ocean and the Sea of Okhotsk. On the other, it's sparsely populated. Only around 300,000 people live on the peninsula, most concentrated in a few towns like Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. Outside those urban areas, the land is wild, unforgiving, vast, and in many places inaccessible except by helicopter or days-long overland expeditions. That isolation is both a blessing and a curse. On the positive side, it means fewer human casualties when eruptions occur. But it also means less infrastructure, fewer monitoring stations, and slower response times. In the event of a massive multi-volcano eruption, getting aid into Kamchatka would be a logistical nightmare. And yet, this very isolation has preserved Kamchatka as a natural laboratory, one where Earth's rawest forces play out with minimal interference. International research teams have long sought access to Kamchatka for this reason. The volcanoes here are among the most accessible of the large explosive type. Accessible, that is, by scientific standards. Their behavior helps researchers understand how pressure builds in magma chambers, how gas release can signal an impending eruption, and how ash spreads globally after major blasts. Each eruption from Kamchatka offers data that helps refine models used to predict activity in more densely populated areas like Japan, Indonesia, and the US Pacific Northwest. There's another reason Kamchatka matters: aviation safety. Dozens of international flight paths between North America and Asia cross over or near the peninsula. In 2010, when Eyjafjallajökull erupted in Iceland, ash clouds grounded over 100,000 flights in Europe. Kamchatka's volcanoes have similar potential. During the Klyuchevskoy eruption, multiple trans-Pacific flights were diverted. The region is constantly monitored by volcanic ash advisory centers, VIS, in Tokyo and Anchorage, who assess satellite images to ensure that jets don't fly through invisible ash plumes that could destroy their engines mid-air. But what happens underground is just as important as what happens in the sky. Kamchatka sits above the subduction of the Pacific Plate, beneath the Okhotsk Plate. This is a tectonic engine that drives both seismic and volcanic activity. As one plate dives under another, it melts rock, generating magma. That magma rises, pushing through faults and weak zones in the crust. The longer that pressure builds, the more violent the release. That's the story behind most of Kamchatka's eruptions, including Klyuchevskoy's. Volcanologists use a range of tools to study these processes. INSAR, interferometric synthetic aperture radar, can detect centimeter-level ground deformation, showing whether a volcano is inflating or deflating. Seismographs track tremors too small for humans to feel. Gas spectrometers measure sulfur dioxide and other emissions, and thermal imaging identifies heat increases that suggest magma movement. The data from Kamchatka's most recent eruption is still being processed, but early indicators point to rapid vertical magma ascent, possibly from deep mantle sources. What concerns scientists most is the potential for cluster activity. In other words, the eruption of one volcano increasing the likelihood of activity in others nearby. This is not speculation, it's happened before. In 1975, multiple volcanoes in central Kamchatka erupted within a 6-month window. In 2007, Bezimiany and Klyuchevskoy erupted nearly simultaneously. Stress redistribution, deep magma pooling, and hydrothermal shifts can all interact, especially after a major quake like the one on July 30th. That quake, now confirmed as one of the 6 largest in recorded history, didn't just shake buildings. It likely disturbed the entire regional magma plumbing system. Geologists are now closely watching for changes in gas flux and ground motion at neighboring volcanoes. A chain reaction of eruptions, while not inevitable, is scientifically plausible. And Kamchatka's history supports this possibility. Ancient ash layers preserved in ice cores show evidence of simultaneous or rapid succession eruptions from multiple peaks. Some of these events may have impacted global climate in prehistoric times. If something like that happened today, the results could be devastating, not just for Russia, but for global air traffic, agriculture, and even temperature patterns. Kamchatka may seem distant, remote, forgotten, but geologically it is central. It is a barometer of the Earth's stress. When its volcanoes speak, they send signals far beyond the clouds that hide them. They warn us, they teach us. And if we don't listen, they will remind us, in fire and ash, that silence does not mean safety. It wasn't just Russia that responded when the Earth shook. Within minutes of the 5.8 magnitude earthquake off Kamchatka, an invisible force began traveling across the Pacific at the speed of a jetliner. Beneath the calm surface of the ocean, a tsunami wave was on its way, vast, fast, and unforgiving. And before it even touched a single shore, it sparked a wave of panic that reached across continents. The Pacific Ocean, the largest and most populated water basin on the planet, became a theater of alert. At exactly 3:52 a.m. local time, 5 minutes after the earthquake, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, PTWC, in Hawaii issued the first regional tsunami alert. At that moment, the full extent of the rupture zone wasn't yet mapped. But the initial seismic data, combined with real-time readings from DART, Deep Ocean Assessment and reporting of tsunami buoys, confirmed something massive had occurred. Multiple buoys detected sudden pressure changes in the deep ocean, signals that a long rolling wave had begun spreading out. Countries across the Pacific Rim scrambled. Japan's meteorological agency activated full-scale coastal alerts, advising residents in 10 prefectures to evacuate low-lying areas. Sirens blared in fishing towns and ports. Trains stopped. Flights were grounded. In the Philippines, government agencies ordered preemptive coastal closures. In Hawaii, tsunami warning sirens echoed across islands just after 6 a.m. local time, waking families and sending thousands fleeing toward inland shelters. In the United States, West Coast emergency systems were activated by 7 a.m. PST. Though the wave would take hours to arrive, the memory of previous disasters made officials act quickly. In California, Oregon, and Washington, tsunami advisories were broadcast via text, TV, and social media. Law enforcement and fire departments conducted loudspeaker patrols in at-risk neighborhoods. Coastal roads were closed, beaches were evacuated. Some cities, like Crescent City, already devastated by tsunamis in 1964 and 2011, went into full alert mode. The anxiety was compounded by uncertainty. Tsunami waves are not predictable like storms. They don't arrive as a single crash, but as a series of pulses, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes hours. The first wave might be small, lulling people into false security, The second or third can be the killer. This makes evacuation orders more difficult to time. In Japan, authorities urged citizens not to return until the official all clear. In California, some residents, unfamiliar with the advisory language, remained unsure if they were truly at risk. The first real impact was recorded in Severodvinsk, a Russian town northeast of the epicenter. A wave approximately 1.5 meters high struck the coast at 4:45 a.m. local time. It flooded streets, carried vehicles, and damaged fishing infrastructure. Fortunately, most residents had already moved to higher ground. The event confirmed the worst. The tsunami was real, and it was moving fast. By 7 a.m. in Japan, surges of up to 1 meter reached northern coastal towns. Ports were swamped. Boats were overturned. In Hokkaido, tsunami barriers slowed the waves, but not all areas were protected. Bullet trains were suspended. Coastal nuclear facilities entered defensive protocols. No casualties were reported, but the disruption was significant and emotionally jarring for a nation still recovering from the 2011 disaster that claimed over 18,000 lives. As the wave pushed eastward, attention turned to the United States. Hawaii, sitting in the direct path, braced for potential impact. Tsunami modeling estimated the arrival time around 11:30 a.m. local time. While initial forecasts predicted 1 to 2 meter waves, those were adjusted downward as more data came in. The final recorded wave height at Hilo was under 0.4 meters, large enough to cause strong currents, but not structural damage. Still, beaches were cleared, harbors closed, and school classes cancelled across the state. Governor-issued warnings urged residents not to underestimate the threat. On the west coast of the US, the wave arrived as a series of subtle but measurable surges. In Crescent City and Brookings, Oregon, tidal gauges detected oscillations of 20 to 50 centimeters, enough to disrupt port activity, but far from catastrophic. Despite this, the response remained firm. Officials chose caution over risk. In Santa Cruz, California, surfers were pulled from the water. In Long Beach, port workers temporarily evacuated cargo zones. Emergency services used the event to test procedures, identify weak points in communications, and evaluate public readiness. But even without major destruction, the tsunami served as a global warning system stress test. How fast could data be shared? How accurate were the models? Would people listen? The answer was mixed. In nations like Japan and New Zealand with long histories of seismic disaster, response systems were seamless. Evacuations were orderly, messaging was clear. In Hawaii, the alert system worked, though some areas reported sirens sounding late. On the US mainland, confusion arose around terminology. The difference between a tsunami watch, advisory, and warning remained unclear for many. Some thought the advisory meant it was safe, others panicked, believing a large wave was imminent. Social media helped but also hurt, spreading both helpful instructions and misinformation. Technologically, the event proved how vital dark buoys are. These undersea instruments, stationed across the Pacific, relayed second-by-second changes in water pressure to forecast centers. Without them, tsunami modeling would rely on historical data alone. The Kamchatka quake also demonstrated the value of GPS buoys, an emerging technology that can measure vertical displacement of the sea surface in real time, providing earlier and more accurate wave height estimates. Politically, the event prompted renewed discussion about funding. In the US, agencies like NOAA and FEMA face budget battles every year. After the Kamchatka tsunami alert, lawmakers in coastal states began calling for increased investment in early warning systems, community education, and evacuation infrastructure, especially in rural areas with limited access to real-time communication. Globally, the tsunami ripple extended beyond water. Stock markets responded to the news. Airlines revised routes. Shipping delays affected supply chains moving through the North Pacific. Insurance companies began calculating potential exposure. Even though the physical damage was limited, the economic and psychological effects were tangible. Perhaps most importantly, the event rekindled a collective memory. Images of families fleeing, sirens echoing, and empty beaches flashed across screens. People remembered 2004 in Indonesia, 2010 in Chile, and 2011 in Japan. And they asked, would we be ready if the next one was worse? The Kamchatka tsunami didn't wipe out towns, but it woke up cities. It showed what could happen, what might still happen, and how thin the line is between warning and impact. In the hours following the wave's retreat, coastal communities debriefed. Emergency managers reviewed logs. Scientists downloaded terabytes of ocean data. The Pacific returned to calm, but minds remained alert. This was not just a distant disaster. It was a preview, a question mark drawn in salt water, and one that still hangs over every coastline that shares the Pacific's restless edge. The Kamchatka disaster shocked the world. A massive earthquake, a volcanic eruption, a tsunami threat stretching from Russia to California. But for the United States, the most unsettling part wasn't what happened there. It's what could happen here. Because the US West Coast is not just vulnerable to the same kind of event. In some ways, it's even more at risk. Let's look at the geology first. Kamchatka sits on a subduction zone, the Pacific Plate diving beneath the Okhotsk Plate. The US has two subduction zones of its own, the Eruption Trench off Alaska and the Cascadia subduction zone running from Northern California to British Columbia. Cascadia is perhaps the most quietly dangerous fault line in North America. It's capable of producing a magnitude 9.0 earthquake. And the last time it did, January 26, 1700. Now, over 300 years later, stress has been building once again. Geologists have warned that a full rupture of the Cascadia zone could mirror the Kamchatka event almost perfectly. A massive offshore quake, followed within hours by tsunamis and potential volcanic activity from peaks like Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, or Mount Shasta. The only difference? Millions more people would be in the impact zone. Imagine it, 4 a.m. on a Tuesday. A rupture begins offshore. In less than 90 seconds, the shaking reaches Seattle, then Portland, then Sacramento. Buildings sway, bridges crack, power grids shut down, water mains burst. The ground in some areas liquefies, a known phenomenon in quake-prone sedimentary zones. Fires ignite, and then comes the second threat, the tsunami. Depending on where the quake hits and how the seafloor shifts, a massive wave could arrive at the Oregon coast within 15 to 30 minutes. Coastal towns like Newport, Brookings, and Coos Bay sit within zones of total inundation. Even with fast alerts, roads out of these areas are few, and many are likely to be damaged by the quake itself. Helicopter rescue? It might come days later. For some, it would come too late. Further south in California, places like Crescent City and Eureka have long histories of tsunami damage. In a 1964 quake, Crescent City was hit with waves over 20 feet high, killing 11 people. A modern-day equivalent, triggered by a Cascadia rupture, could be far worse. Crescent City still relies on sirens and rapid public messaging. But at night, with limited cell reception and aging infrastructure, it's a race against the clock. Inland, cities like Seattle and Portland are built on sedimentary basins, natural amplifiers of ground motion. That means a quake of the same magnitude would likely feel stronger and last longer in these areas than it did in Kamchatka. Older buildings, especially brick structures built before modern seismic codes, would suffer massive damage. Hospitals might collapse. Highways could be severed. The Seattle Viaduct and aging bridges across the Willamette River could fall, cutting cities in half. What about volcanic risk? Unlike Kamchatka, where one dominant volcano, Klyuchevskoy, responded quickly to the quake, the US West Coast features a chain of potentially active volcanoes. The Cascade Volcanic Arc stretches from Northern California through Oregon and Washington. Most of these peaks, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, are stratovolcanoes like Klyuchevskoy, and most are capable of explosive eruptions. Scientists believe that a powerful earthquake along the Cascadia zone could trigger one or more of these systems if they are already under pressure. Rainier is particularly concerning due to its size, glacier coverage, and proximity to densely populated areas. A lahar from Rainier caused by melting ice and volcanic debris could reach Tacoma in less than an hour. The same applies to Mount Hood's east flank and the rivers leading toward Portland. This isn't science fiction. FEMA's own internal report, known as Cascadia Rising, modeled a scenario similar to what happened in Kamchatka. The outcome? Over 13,000 deaths, 27,000 injuries, and over 1 million displaced Americans. That's not from a future we hope never comes. That's from a real threat scientists expect will come. So how does the US compare in preparedness? In terms of science and monitoring, the US is among the most advanced. The Shake Alert early warning system on the west coast can detect initial seismic waves and send alerts before the worst shaking begins, buying 10 to 60 seconds of warning in some areas. For tsunamis, NOAA maintains a network of dark buoys, coastal tide gauges and modeling systems that can predict wave arrival times and heights with increasing accuracy. But warning systems are only as effective as the people who receive them. And here lies a gap. In Japan, tsunami drills are conducted annually in coastal schools. In the US, many residents of vulnerable coastal towns have never practiced a tsunami evacuation. Some don't know their risk zones. Others assume a tsunami only means a giant wave, when in reality deadly surges can appear as fast-moving floods, invisible from the beach until it's too late. Infrastructure, too, is a problem. Many cities still have unreinforced masonry buildings, aging dams, and limited vertical evacuation options. Coastal communities lack clear signage, reliable high ground, or transportation for those who can't flee on foot. In rural Oregon, for instance, some coastal schools are still located within tsunami zones with no official relocation plan. And then there's the human factor, what experts call warning fatigue. In places like California, where small tremors are common, people tend to ignore alerts or underestimate risk. That complacency can be deadly in a major event. But the lessons from Kamchatka offer a chance to fix that. We've now seen what happens when a megathrust quake triggers an eruption and a tsunami within the span of a single day. We've seen the timeline. Under 5 minutes for the tsunami alert, under 3 hours for the volcano, under 12 hours for waves to reach Hawaii. In the US, we can use that timeline as a template for drills, policy, and infrastructure redesign. Building codes must continue to evolve. Federal funding must prioritize pre-disaster mitigation, not just post-disaster recovery. Emergency communication networks must be stress-tested, especially in regions with limited broadband access. Education programs should be launched in multiple languages, aimed at youth and elderly populations alike. And perhaps most critically, coastal relocation plans must be taken seriously, not just studied, but implemented. The Kamchatka disaster was a warning sent across water, air, and fire. It whispered what the Earth could do, and what it will do again. Not in some far-off land, but possibly right here. Along the shores of Oregon, beneath the hills of California, through the cities we call home. The question is no longer if, it's when, and more importantly, will we be ready? The lava has cooled, the wave has retreated, the ground has fallen silent. But the story of Kamchatka's disaster does not end with stillness. It begins there. Because what the world witnessed across less than 24 hours was not just a regional crisis in a remote part of Russia. It was a real-time, real-world demonstration of how Earth behaves when multiple natural forces converge. It was also a test of global readiness, and a reminder that even with all our satellites, sensors, and simulations, nature can still outpace us. The 8.8 magnitude earthquake that struck off the eastern coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula was among the most powerful in recorded history. It happened without warning, during the dead of night. It shifted the seafloor by meters, warped the surrounding landscape, and sent seismic waves echoing across oceans. In its wake, the Klyuchevskoy volcano erupted with sudden violence, an event triggered not over days or weeks, but mere hours. A tsunami alert spanned from Japan to California. Evacuations began, flights were rerouted, a planet held its breath. And when the danger passed, we were left with questions about physics, about readiness, and about the limits of our own systems. Kamchatka is a place few people will ever visit, but its impact has now been felt globally, not in terms of widespread destruction, but in the mirror it holds up to the rest of us. Because while Kamchatka's population is sparse, its tectonic behavior closely mirrors that of other densely populated areas, places like Tokyo, Anchorage, San Francisco, and Santiago. The subduction zones that form the Kamchatka Arc are not unique. They exist all around the Pacific, forming a connected system of risk. What happens in one zone informs what could happen in another. We have learned that mega-earthquakes can come without historical precedent. The Kamchatka quake was the strongest in the region in over half a century, but it did not follow a clear buildup of tremors. It wasn't forecasted by any predictive model. Instead, it was discovered by shaking ground and flashing sensors. That reality demands humility from scientists and planners alike. Prediction remains a work in progress. What we can control, however, is preparation. We've also seen how quickly multiple disasters can cascade. A quake leads to a tsunami. A quake leads to a volcanic eruption. An eruption leads to air traffic disruption. Ash leads to air quality concerns. Each stage compounds the last. And with climate change reshaping the environment, melting glaciers, altering ocean temperatures, changing seasonal rainfall, the behavior of fault lines and magma chambers may evolve in ways we don't fully understand. Kamchatka might be the first major event of a new era in natural disasters, where speed, scale, and interconnection define the threats we face. So where do we go from here? First, we must expand the scope of our early warning systems. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center worked as designed, but lag and coverage gaps still exist in rural areas, and terminology confusion still persists in countries like the United States. Watch, advisory, and warning are not intuitive terms to everyone. A tsunami wave doesn't need to be 10 feet tall to be deadly. It only takes a surge moving faster than a car to take lives. Second, the public's understanding of disaster risk must mature. In an age of constant social media and instant gratification, long-term preparedness is a hard message to sell, but it's vital. What you do before the disaster determines what you survive afterward. Do families have go-bags? Do schools have evacuation routes? Are seniors accounted for? Are non-English speakers receiving alerts in time? These are not abstract questions. They are life and death details. Third, we must invest more in scientific collaboration across borders. Kamchatka is Russian territory, but the lessons from its quake and eruption are global. US, Japanese, South Korean, and European agencies should have immediate access to seismic and volcanic data from any major event. The same way global health communities collaborate during disease outbreaks, our geoscientific community must treat earthquakes and eruptions as international emergencies, not national ones. Fourth, we must rethink our relationship with risk zones. Coastal development continues in high-hazard areas. Critical infrastructure, hospitals, water systems, data centers, is often built without redundancy. In many areas, emergency response is underfunded or reactive. Kamchatka's event must serve as a catalyst to review urban planning, insurance frameworks, and infrastructure resilience. Are our ports ready for seismic shocks? Are our highways ready for liquefaction? Is our electrical grid ready for cascading failure? Fifth, the psychological toll of disaster must not be underestimated. The people of Kamchatka will live with the trauma of a night where the ground would not stop shaking and the mountain exploded in fire. Even without widespread fatalities, the memory of fear can alter communities. Mental health services must be built into any long-term recovery plan, not just food and shelter, but healing. Perhaps most critically, we must listen. Kamchatka was the planet speaking. The language was tectonic. The vocabulary made of fire and water and ash. We must learn to interpret it, not as isolated calamity, but as part of Earth's living system. A system we depend on, but cannot control. And one whose rhythm we ignore at our peril. As of now, Kamchatka's volcanoes have calmed. The ash is falling slowly. The ocean has stilled. The seismic waves have echoed into the distance. But in every emergency center, every geological observatory, and every coastal town, the lesson endures. The next disaster is not far away. It may not come from Russia. It may come from our own shoreline, from our own forgotten fault, from the mountains we ski on or the bays we build beside. That's why Kamchatka matters. Not because of its location, but because of its truth. The Earth is always moving, and the real question is, are we moving with it, or pretending it stands still? If this video helped you understand the world's hidden risks a little more clearly, we invite you to join us on the full journey. This is just the beginning of our 10-part series on the Kamchatka disaster and the future of natural threats.